I'm Dom Nicholls, and this is Ukraine the Latest. Today, we take a deep dive into the battlefield tactics being employed by Ukraine in the Kursk operation.
Bravery takes you through the most unimaginable hardships to finally reward you with victory.
The first duty of my government is security and defence, to make clear our unshakable support of NATO and with our allies towards Ukraine.
Kyiv stands strong.
Nobody's going to break us. We're strong. We're Ukrainians.
It's Friday, the 16th of August, 2 years and 179 days since the full-scale invasion began. Today, I'm joined by Assistant Comment Editor Francis Dearnley, former tank commander and chemical and biological weapons expert Hamish de-Bretton, and from Washington, D.C., RAND Corporation researcher Michael Bohnert. I started with the latest news from Ukraine and Russia. I'll start in the Kursk area from a Russian commentator, not known if he or she is a military blogger or serving military personnel. That latter would be my guess based on the sensible military detail in the commentary they provide. But anyway, they've said that Ukraine is pushing hard into that pocket of land to the west of Sudzha that I've been talking about just lately. So a very quick reminder, northeast of Ukraine is the city of Sumy, very close to the border, about 10 km from the border. Over the border there is the Russian town city of Sudzha. The border there runs sort of northwest to southeast, except for quite a nice rectangular chunk of Russia that digs into Ukraine. And I've suggested that pocket of land would be very, very valuable if Ukraine were able to take it, because they'd be able to defend there, or they'd have interior lines of supply, so unlikely to be too molested by ground forces, Russian ground forces. And of course, their flanks would be protected because it's a chunk digging into Ukraine. To their flanks, left and right, they've got other Ukrainian territory. So that's the area I'm talking about. Looking into that area there, you've got the town of Glushkovo, about 40 km northwest of Sudzha, 15 km southwest of Koronovo, the other town we've been talking about in that region. The border from Glushkovo is about 10 kilometres due south. Now, it looks like the furthest Ukraine seems to have pushed so far into that pocket is up to a village called Vonikzepne. That's about halfway from Sudzha to Glushkovo. The front line seems to be from there sort of due north to just to the west of Koronovo. There's been reports that Ukrainian forces have been trying to push left and right, east and west of Koronovo, bypassing the main defended area there. Now then, in that area, in this pocket, the bottom third of it is delineated by the River Seym. Now, there are 4 bridges in the immediate area that we need to look at. There's one in the town of Glushkovo, 2 more slightly to the northwest, out to about sort of 10 k's, and 1 more about the same distance, 10 k's to the southeast. That one is thought to already be under drone attack. The Russian forces in the area between the river and the border with Ukraine are resupplied over those bridges, and they're also the routes through which evacuated Russian civilians are thought to be travelling. So if Ukraine takes those bridges, they will be in a much better place to cut off that entire section of the pocket. Now, just south or due south from Glushkovo, just over the border into Ukraine, a couple of k's inside Ukraine, is the town of Obody. There's another push north from there by Ukrainian forces into the pocket. There's a Russian town called Tekhino right down in the far corner, but Ukraine seem to be ignoring that at the moment. Don't go for strength, go for where the enemy is not. So they seem to have ignored Tekhino to try and push north from Obody, whilst also going west into this pocket, trying to take those bridges and just cut off all the Russian forces in there. Now then, this same Russian commentator is also posting that Ukraine is pushing southeast, albeit in much smaller groupings, possibly just recce elements, that's my interpretation, from Sudzha towards the town of Giri. We've talked about that over the last few days. Giri is about 20 k's away, roughly along the line of another river. Ukraine seems to have had limited success pushing directly southeast there. They have gone further south along the border with Ukraine, but they seem to be trying to push towards Giri, maybe across the river for the same reasons as I've just described, to take the bridges, and then everything inside of that can be squeezed against the border. Elsewhere on the Kursk front, geolocated footage from the Institute for the Study of War taken yesterday shows Ukrainian forces at least 2 kilometres east of Sudzha. So that seems to be the front line there, east of Sudzha, albeit with these possibly reconnaissance elements. We're not entirely sure what a little bit further forward to the southeast towards Giri. That's that in that area there. Now, yesterday, the Freedom of Russia Legion, this grouping of, we think, they purport to be pro-Ukrainian Russians, they made two other border incursions over the last sort of 18 months, which may or may not have been electromagnetic recce's for what's happening right now. Anyway, the Freedom of Russian Legion yesterday appealed to Russian troops to surrender and switch sides to join the fight for what they say is for the normal future of Russia. The unit's statement on Telegram did not directly mention the Kursk incursion, but said, "Your political officers, sitting in the warm rear, tell you not to surrender, but to blow yourself up with your own grenade. But hundreds of Russian soldiers ignore this criminal order, choosing to live rather than to die for a medal for some colonel or a new mansion for Gerasimov." That reporting comes from Kyiv Independent. Inside Ukraine now, and Russia has continued its tempo of operations in the east. There are reports Ukraine has ordered the evacuation of the town of Kursk, which has been under huge pressure for a number of weeks now. Ukrainian officials say Russian forces are advancing on the city, quote, at a fast pace. And authorities said in a Telegram post that with every passing day, there is less and less time to collect personal belongings and leave for safer regions. There is no sign yet of the Kursk operation impacting events there in the east. Although having said that, US officials are saying that Russia has moved, in their words, several thousand troops from occupied Ukraine to defend the Kursk area. Unnamed officials speaking to CNN yesterday said at least 1,000 Russian troops have been diverted to the border region since the assault started last week. John Kirby, the National Security Council spokesperson, chap I interviewed in the White House last September, he said last night, "It's apparent to us that Mr. Putin and the Russian military are diverting some resources, some units, towards the Kursk Oblast to ostensibly counter what the Ukrainians are doing." Elsewhere yesterday, Ukraine say they shot down all 5 Russia-launched drones, 3 Shaheeds and 2 drones of an unidentified type, that were launched overnight. This comes from the country's Air Force speaking this morning. Russian forces also said to have used 3 ballistic Iskander-M missiles during the attack. No reports of casualties. And then, really interesting one, this Ukrainian forces reportedly struck the Kursk ferry crossing in Crimea overnight. It's thought another site, including a boat, I'm going to say maritime vessel, but why use 2 words, near the community of Chernomorsk in Russia's Krasnodar Krai was also struck. So that's the bit of Russia east of Kursk. So come out of Ukraine over the Kursk bridge if you want to, and then that's the bit you hit in Russia. Now, Sergei Bratchuk, a spokesperson for the Odessa Oblast Military Administration, was reporting that. It's not known if the boat that was reported in Russia was a military target. A fire was reported near the city of Kursk in the area of the ferry crossing, which is basically next to the bridge. Possibly connected, probably connected. In a statement posted early this morning, Russia's MOD claimed to have intercepted and destroyed 5 aircraft-type UAVs over the Black Sea, uninhabited air vehicles, drones, you and me, and 2 boats, what they say was heading towards Crimea. No evidence given there. Now, the Crimean Wind Telegram channel, citing local residents, said there were loud explosions across multiple sites in occupied Crimea last night. Kyiv Independent reporting that residents in Sevastopol, that's obviously right down in the southwest of Crimea, Simferopol in the centre south, and Kursk over in the east, heard explosions around 3:30 in the morning local time. Local reporters also say multiple explosions were reported in Chernomorsk. That's the bit where the boat was hit, around 4:30 local. Local residents say the Kursk bridge was closed to traffic around 2 a.m. this morning, reopened 7 a.m. local time. There were reports, unverified reports, of large traffic queues there. We've not been able to identify or independently verify any of these claims. Very, very difficult to get to be able to do so. But you may remember back in June, Ukraine's Navy spokesperson, Dmitry Pletenchuk, he was speaking to RBC Ukraine, the media outlet, and they said destroying the Kursk bridge would not have the same effect now because Russia barely uses it for military purposes anymore. This is Mr. Pletenchuk speaking. He said the bridge accounts for less than a quarter of the total transiting cargo, and for the rest, Russia uses this ferry crossing into Kursk. That is possibly, my view now, possibly one of the reasons why we've not seen a concerted effort to stick a storm shadow through the bridge in recent months, and maybe why the ferry is getting a bit more attention. However, it is worth noting that today, or this morning, Russia's MOD said that they shot down 12 ATACMS launched overnight as part of this attack on, well, they say, the attack on the Kursk bridge. And again, no evidence provided there, but I mention it just because you'll see that doing the rounds. Just finally, for me, last night, President Zelensky held a meeting with the Stavka, that's the Ukrainian High Command. This is ISW reporting, Institute for the Study of War. Ukraine's Commander-in-Chief, General Alexander Syrsky, said that Ukraine had created a military commandant's office in Kursk Oblast under the leadership of Major General Eduard Moskolyov to, quote, maintain law and order and ensure the priority needs of the population. Ukraine's done this basically across the whole of their country, and now the little bit of Russia as well, put in a military administration to knit together the military and the civil sector. You'll see it on social media. There are reports of Ukrainian troops handing out water and helping residents and all the rest of it. You would expect to see that. I think that's only sensible use of the media. Quite how far the administration is going to go, we don't know, but obviously we'll keep an eye on that. Now, separately, Ukraine's ombudsman, Dmitry Lubinets, he said Ukraine is preparing to coordinate prisoner of war exchanges with Russia, and said he is already in communication with his Russian counterpart about the possibility of exchanging hundreds of Russian POWs that Ukraine has reportedly captured in the Kursk operation for Ukrainian prisoners of war in Russian captivity. We think, from what I could tell, from all the bits and pieces I've seen, and again, it's very difficult to get any real sense of the numbers here, but we think Ukraine has kind of low hundreds, maybe 500, 600-ish, possibly, Russian troops, prisoners of war, and we think Russia has about 5, 6, 7,000 Ukrainian prisoners of war, including some from the Azov Brigade, the Mariupol defenders. So we will watch that one with interest. Of course, Russia will be very keen, or Putin in particular, very keen to get the conscripts back. Russian conscripts is a way where society does actually sit up and take notice and say, oi, chum, Vladimir Vladimirovich, that's not on. So the conscripts do seem to have an importance that outweigh the simple numbers. But that's where we're on the tactical updates. Francis, good to have you in the other studio. I don't mean that in a bad way. It's great to have you on. Right, I better shut up now. Francis, what have you been looking at?
Thanks, Tom. I won't take it personally. Once again, even in the political realm, it's all Kursk. I don't think Kursk has been talked about this much beyond World War II conventions for over 80 years. As we've been discussing all week, this operation has totally changed the tone of the diplomatic conversation at a critical juncture. It's now Ukraine that talks about creating buffer zones. It's now Ukraine which is setting the parameters for peace negotiations. Indeed, only today, Mikhailo Podolyak, one of Zelensky's chief advisors, one of those we spoke to in Kyiv back in February, has said that his battle and the battle that Kyiv is facing now could force Moscow to the table. He said, in the Kursk region, we can clearly see how the military tool is being used objectively to persuade the Russian Federation to enter a fair negotiation process, he said. Now, I would argue that's untrue, by the way. In fact, it's made the likelihood of negotiations far less likely because Russia cannot conceivably call for a freezing of the front lines, given Ukraine is in its territory. Bear in mind, if Kyiv is able to hold on to even a few dozen miles of Russian territory come November, then that would be massive if Trump were to win the presidency. Even if they don't, this operation, though, will compel the Kremlin to pull larger numbers away, as you were just talking about, Dom, from John Kirby's remarks, from Ukraine to defend its borders, which will surely have an impact on the Ukraine front lines and allow potentially Kyiv to make some gains at the front. But nonetheless, Podolyak's statement is politically significant, as it now suggests that Kyiv is willing to talk and it's Moscow who are the impediment, even if that's not really accurate. The fact is, neither side will want to talk now, I would argue. Putin wants peace, once people used to say. Yes, I would say a piece of Ukraine, a piece of Moldova, a piece of Georgia, measured in territory or political influence. But I think we can expect that narrative to wane now until the Kremlin gets this crisis under control. they will be praying for a Kyiv withdrawal sooner rather than later. But whether they will depend entirely, I would posit, on the reality on the battlefield over the coming days. We should anticipate alarmist rhetoric from Russia and its proxies talking about escalation. Already one has a Russian parliamentary deputy saying it all risks World War III. He said, considering the presence of Western military equipment, the use of Western ammunition and missiles in attacks on civilian infrastructure, and irrefutable proof of foreigners' participation in the attack on Russian territory, one could come to the conclusion that the world is on the brink of a third world war. Now, bear in mind, that will have been green-lit by the Kremlin for him to say, no doubt. But it bears repeating, Russia is not capable of fighting a world war, and they cannot even flirt with using nuclear weapons, which is the one trump card they have, without losing their key ally of China. And even if they did use them, it would lead to their total destruction. So what would be the point? Kyiv has shown how vacuous, arguably, those escalatory arguments were all along by this incursion, because, as we were saying the other day, if not now, do you threaten and use nukes? Then when? When you have soldiers crossing your border and threatening your cities. And yet there's nothing that Moscow can realistically do. Now, just on the subject of negotiations, Belarus's Lukashenko has said, let's all sit at the negotiating table and end this scuffle. Now, whether that is a statement that's being encouraged by the Kremlin, which feels unlikely, or whether it's Lukashenko breaking rank as an ally, remains to be seen. But I would suggest that this is an interesting development, given that Belarus must surely be aware that Kyiv has now no fear of crossing borders. And Belarus, of course, was the launching pad for Russia's forces on the attack on Kyiv in 2022. Indeed, only today, a Belarusian defence minister has warned that his country could be dragged into a wider conflict. Could, and I think it's probably not, but could this be some evidence of a fracturing of that solid alliance between Belarus and Russia? Because, as I say, Moscow will not want there to be talk of peace negotiations whilst this incursion is happening. Now, in terms of the Western response, there are reports that talks between Ukraine and US President Joe Biden's administration about supplies of long-range cruise missiles are in the advanced stages. That's coming from Zelensky's administration. The Kyiv Independent are doing more on this. The timeline of when those missiles could arrive in Ukraine is unclear, the source said. But fall is the consideration, apparently, autumn to British listeners. Yesterday, Politico reported, citing undisclosed sources, that the administration is open to supplying Kyiv with long-range cruise missiles to bolster the recently provided F-16 fighter jets, among other purposes. There had been indicators that Biden's leaving office has led him to being less constrained with regard to his actions on Ukraine. This might well point to that, but again, that's just speculative. Staying with the White House, Biden has just met with British-Russian citizen Vladimir Kara-Murza, who was, of course, released as part of that major prisoner exchange with Russia earlier this month. Biden said today his whole family is whole once more, and tweeted a photograph of it. I can imagine Kara-Murza had some candid conversations with the president about his experiences in Russia. Another reason why Moscow arguably lost more than it gained in that prisoner swap, as we discussed at the time. Kara-Murza and others are extremely articulate, passionate and knowledgeable on Russia, and no doubt they will be sharing their thoughts with the president and others in the conversations that have taken place since the release. Now, you mentioned John Kirby there, Dom, White House's National Securities Communications Advisor, of course, and he said that following the verdict yesterday on the US-Russian ballerina we were talking about, who donated $50 to Ukraine, he said it's vindictive cruelty. We've spoken out about her case before, he said, when she was charged and arrested. This sentence just proves all the more that there's no real system of justice coming out of Moscow. And just lastly, a quick update on economics, since we discussed it at length yesterday. If you're interested in that front, then do listen back to that episode. Very interesting reflections from our economics editor here, Sue Chan. But the Kyiv Independent are analysing how Ukraine has exported over 64 million metric tonnes of goods to 46 countries since the temporary Black Sea corridor began operating. That's coming from the Infrastructure Ministry on the year anniversary. I can't believe it's been a year since its operation began on August the 16th, 2023. This volume, of course, included 43.5 million metric tons of agricultural products exported through that shipping route over the past year. A total of 3,379 vessels have used the corridor to export goods to Asia, Africa and Europe. And so just yet further evidence, really, of this little talked about but still important Ukrainian success when measured in terms of the Black Sea Fleet, this latest incursion, some of the economic situations at the moment. Now, we mustn't get ahead of ourselves, but there is certainly a sense that following the incursion that the tone of the conversation has changed. And whilst that may not be as significant in the military terms as some would argue, at the end of the day, the Ukrainian forces are still extremely stretched in Ukraine itself. Nonetheless, that change in tone of conversation in and of itself can be counted as a success for Kyiv because of the impact it will have on the negotiations conversation and, more crucially, on weapons deliveries. And perhaps some of those stories we've reported on today would indicate that. But that's where we are, Dom, in terms of the political ramifications of an extraordinary, near fortnight.
Thanks, Francis. More from you a bit later. It is really interesting how after the sort of tactical activity, you then get these ripples through the diplomatic space and the narrative and all that kind of stuff. So, really interesting to pick up on these signals. Anyway, I am in charge today. I'm the Grand Fromage. David is away working on his beard and doing other stuff, exciting stuff in Scotland. So I wanted to have a proper, super-duper, sub-tactical geekathon deep dive into what we think's happened over the last couple of weeks. And I'm delighted to welcome back to the pod Hamish, DBG, de-Bretton Gordon, and RAND Corporation researcher Michael Bohnert. We will get the tank's eye view shortly from Hamish. But first, and sorry for the early start, Michael, how's the day starting in Washington? I think Mr. Google told me it was going to be a nice sunny day today. Welcome. Can you tell us a little bit first of all, about your work and your area of focus before we dive into the tactics?
Sure. So I work at RAND as a engineer in military acquisition, covering everything from requirements to scenarios, effectiveness, all the way to industrial base. So where this is dovetailed with some of my recent work is actually looking at helicopter survivability as well as drones. It just also happens that I started my career a decade and a half ago in electronic warfare at the Office of Naval Intelligence. So this campaign's been of a lot of interest to me today.
I almost don't know where to start. When we were chatting in recent days, there's just so much we can get into. So, Michael, Russian forces were surprised by this attack into Kursk. For all the surveillance equipment they have, eyes, binoculars, electromagnetic, all the rest of it, should they have been?
They should not have been surprised at all. It's impressive that they missed this. My hypothesis is the Freedom of Russia legions had desensitized them over the years, just thinking this might have been another small incursion. But the propensity of ISR should have guaranteed this was seen weeks in advance. So either A, Sersky and the Ukrainians did the most impressive level of hiding in the history of modern warfare, or Russia to simply continue to drop the ball. They have an impressive history of doing that.
Yeah, ISR, of course, being intelligence, surveillance and reconnaissance assets. So, cameras and all that kind of gear, but there's a lot more to it than that. I think that's a really interesting idea about whether or not the Freedom of Russia Legion actions, their two previous incursions, which we think they got a couple of kilometres inside Russia, whether you say that's desensitized them. I posited earlier maybe that was doing an electromagnetic recce. Be interested on your thoughts if you were able to offer anything there. But also, about this, the way Ukraine was able to punch through. I somewhat glibly described it as an electromagnetic black hole that they'd created in the border area through which they then pushed their tanks. Is that fair? How do you make an electromagnetic black hole? And if that's what they did, why can't they, and Russia for that reason, but why can't you just keep doing it every time you want to sort of budge forwards?
So electronic warfare is a really, really difficult and not always intuitive science, more than an art. So, for instance, we heard reports from Russians that in particular their comms were jammed. To jam communications, you usually have to be very close. It's much easier to jam radars for a variety of reasons that I don't want to bore you about. But comms jamming, you have to be very close. So whether Russians did it with recon forces, with SOF, pre-emplacement drones, they have not disclosed that yet. And even if they had, I wouldn't be repeating it. But they had to get very close to a lot of these units, and they very clearly cut their comms off from each other, which is very impressive, especially because to not be seen with EW, the curvature of the Earth matters a lot. So you want to have your jammers high enough to have line of sight to your target, but not too high as to cause jamming of your own forces or to give away your position to intelligence assets that are collecting. So to be able to pull this broadly over a pretty large front means not only that Ukraine very clearly understood where positions were of Russian forces, it also means they knew the terrain very well to be able to mask where they were hiding these and very precisely put these. That's very, very difficult. It shows a very high level of precision and training, which makes me think it probably was more of a special forces in advance. That also is why you haven't seen repeated many other areas. Because there wasn't a defined front line, they were able to use these maneuver forces to place it in these areas, where in the Donbass, it's very hard to get those penetrations to even get behind. Like from a comms jamming, it's ideal to put your jammer between both the sender and recipient, which was possible here because Russians had their forces concentrated in little towns versus spread out in the front. So in many ways, Russia's poor placing of troops made this a lot easier from the EW perspective.
That's amazing. And it probably has something, part of the answer to the next question. I've noticed or seen reports of Ukrainian fast jets over the Kursk region. No F-16s yet, but purportedly other fighters. If that's correct, why do they feel confident flying there? And we see them much less frequently over the battlefields in the east.
The first thing to say is they've been flying the jets very low. With air defense, the curvature of the Earth matters. You know, people always see these huge bubbles that show this massive, what looks like an impenetrable wall of air defenses around Russia. But farther you get down, the line of sight matters. So if you're at a low altitude, a few hundred feet, air defenses have to be very close. We've seen over the past couple of years, Ukraine hitting a lot of Russian air defenses very hard. The HARM missile that was talked about heavily last year, etc. So Russia, we know for a fact, has lost a lot of air defenses. And also these longer range strikes by drones, Russia's pulled a lot of air defenses back to protect air bases and Putin's palaces, a few parts of Moscow, basically the people and areas that either Putin personally cares about, politically cares about, or have an operational effect. The other part is Russia has expended a large number of air defense weapons on land strikes, thinking they wouldn't need these. So looking forward, what that means is there's a lot of black holes, almost like a Swiss cheese mapping around the border where you can now get fighters in. Now, Ukraine brought in their own air defense systems to make a little bubble against Russian aircraft. They've also hit a lot of airfields. My Twitter feed is full of pictures where I've showed how far back you have to push aircraft. Another part is Russia has devoted most of their aircraft to very, very orchestrated, planned strikes with glide weapons in the east. So they have a very rigid air tasking order. So they're lacking in ground-based air defense, and their aircraft are not structured to do this. So Ukraine found a great hole where you can punch an aircraft in low altitude. You can probably repeat this with F-16s. I will say there's going to be a period at some point in a couple weeks where you will see Russia be able to transition air defenses over, but they're going to have to pull those aircraft from striking the Donbass. They're going to have to pull those air defense systems from defending elsewhere. So they're going to have to choose where they pull strike, where they pull air defenses, and they're going to have to stop using their air defense missiles to strike into Ukraine to make sure they have sufficient ones to defend. So this is actually imposing a lot of costs on Russia to be able to counter these aircraft. And having Ukrainian aircraft and lent aircraft by Ukraine flying over is really going to stretch those Russian air assets. I can't speak how critical it is just to have the aircraft flying and shooting, even if they don't hit anything, because it's going to have an outsized impact by stretching Russian assets.
Now, sticking with aircraft, if I may, one more for me, then I know Francis got a couple of questions, and then we'll zoom right down into the turret with Hamish. But there are two stories of Russian helicopters brought down by drone. We think one of them was when a drone went into the tail rotor of, I think it was an Mi-28.
KA-28.
KA-28, yeah. So that's the Alligator. That's the dual rotor, isn't it? So it wouldn't have been one of those. It must have been an Mi-8 or something like that, but that hit the tail rotor. Do you think there are now, Ukraine has the ability, or there are drones out there on the market that can operate, bearing in mind they are very, compared to a helicopter and the downwash of a helicopter, they are very flimsy, let alone the speed you got to achieve. Do you think there are actually heli hunting drones now, and were they lucky shots, or is this actually a capability that the perhaps Ukraine's new drone division has developed?
So the new drones they have coming out are all special purpose. Even the quadcopters are made for higher speed. The fixed wing ones are that way. There's actually, you look at an RC airplane, about 225 miles per hour is about as fast as you can make them cheaply. Ukraine, as part of this offensive, took out a bunch of drones in the sky pretty early on. They showed those videos proudly of the dozens of planes they took out with their latest drones. And they were coming in from a tail chase, which means they're pretty fast. They were taking out drones moving 50 to 70 miles per hour. Apologize to our international friends. I'm American. I'll be speaking in imperial units. So they must have been going easily 100, 120 miles per hour. There actually are 4 videos out there. 2 of them show hits on helicopters. One was an Mi-8. One was the Alligator. But there's also 2 other videos where they missed, where they got close, very close, but they did miss. So it looks like this is a new tactic that Ukraine is using to take out helicopters. Where that matters a lot is given how Russia has placed their troops in and about these little towns, Ukraine is getting fire control over the roads and rails. The only way they're going to be able to resupply is via helicopter. The Russians resupplying these locations. And so they're in this position where, given how the Ukrainian recon units have been very far out there, you're going to expect a lot more units that are just left high and dry because they're not going to be able to get any resupply from the various helicopters. Because man pads are restricted to how far you can get line of sight. You hear me talk about Earth curvature a lot. It matters. The drones you can have at a higher altitude. You can fan them out much further and you can have them loiter. So from a helicopter perspective, like going back to your history, Dom, it's going to be pretty hairy for any of these pilots because the second you slow down to drop supplies, you're going to be very vulnerable to drones. If you're moving, we have the videos where Ukraine showed they were not able to hit them because of downwash and speed. But once they slow down, they're going to be very vulnerable. And a lot of these units of conscripts that are poorly trained are not going to be able to get anyone experienced to come in and bail them out. I mean, these are 18-year-olds coming from St. Petersburg and Moscow and Kaliningrad. They are not hardened troops.
Michael, thanks so much for your time and great to have you back on the podcast. Just a couple of questions from me. You were talking about the impact of aircraft for the Russians, and I just wanted to broaden it out slightly, which is one of the other impacts, of course, as I was touching on earlier on, of this incursion, is that it has shown the vulnerability of Russian borders, not just in the Kursk region, but all around the Ukrainian border. Now, what do you think the impact is going to be if Russia decides to, which, there is some evidence that it already is, if Russia decides that it's going to have to pull out some of its troops from Ukraine in order to protect its border? Because it's not just troops, is it? It's material, it's other defences. So let's just imagine for a moment that Russia recalculates and says, we have to, at all costs, prevent another disaster like this. What are the ramifications of that for what Russia's borders become, and thereby the Ukrainian front lines?
So we're already kind of seeing this. They have pulled a lot of reserves out of Ukraine. It's a moving situation, but there's clearly evidence of that. The other area where we've already seen it is the number of glide bomb strikes in the Donbass has almost halved. And given that Ukraine has been able to hit the air bases in this kind of the western part of the theater, they're having to fly their aircraft from much further away. And the further you fly, the fewer sorties you're able to get off a day, which means fewer bombs. So we're already seeing in the air this have ramifications across the whole front because Russia's having to stretch their aircraft much further and be a little more dynamic. In the Donbass, they're able to hit static targets, which is easy. In the border regions where there's not a static front, aircraft have to spend a lot more time trying to find targets to drop them. And Russia's already accidentally hit a fair number of their own troops, including accidentally posting it on their own national networks, hitting Russian troops. When it comes to stretching troops along the border, I mean, it's going to take tens of thousands of Russian troops to cover this whole region that they have relatively undefended, that Russia's already missing their recruitment targets. So to cover this, they're either going to have to backfill by pulling tens of thousands of troops out of the Donbass, or taking all of their recruitment for the next couple of months, all of their military production for the next couple of months, and lining it along the front, including, as we've already seen on the Russian equivalent of Craigslist, all of their concrete and digging capabilities for the next several months. So you do the math, that means if they're having to redeploy troops for the next 2 to 3 months from the Donbass, any offensives they have in the Donbass are going to stall pretty soon, given their loss rates. That pushes you into late autumn, which means that's the rainy season in this area. No offensives happen in the rain and the mud. And then you get to winter. So this probably, this really decreases the odds of any Russian major offensives for a while. They're going to have to choose to either continue to go on the offensive in the Donbass, or pull troops to make a defensive line, and then pull troops to make maneuver forces to counter Ukraine. I mean, right now, the biggest thing that's preventing Ukraine from advancing further, it's not the Russian forces, it's Ukrainian logistics. They're moving very quickly, and their logistics are struggling to keep up. The POW figures are actually a little bit higher than have been stated. The few statements we're getting out of Ukrainian troops on the move is they're complaining that they're having trouble getting POWs back because they're getting more than they projected. So taking this all collectively, it's going to take 3 to 5 months of Russia's stealth mobilization that's continuing in recruitment just to stabilize this front, more or less drive them back. So Hamish will be talking about the mobility and armor in a moment, but this greatly sets Russia back in any opportunities to push. Either they let Ukraine take half of Kursk province, or Oblast, and keep the Donbass offensive going, or everything on the Russian side freezes. It's Putin's choice, but this is going to be a major setback for Russia. And Ukraine has kind of done, in a politically abstract world, the best option for optimizing their own forces in an attritional conflict. Sorry, I know that was a long answer, Francis.
No, it's absolutely fascinating. I think really this is critical and is not being talked about enough in terms of the ramifications of this Kursk operation. And I'd like to hopefully write something about it today for print tomorrow, and indeed going up tonight, because I think it's so important, this idea of the ramifications across the whole of the border, and thereby the ramifications for Ukraine. Just one other quick question from me, Michael. We mustn't get ahead of ourselves, as I was saying earlier on. When we've had you on in the past, you've been very keen to stress and very articulately and knowledgeably about the limitations of the material that Ukraine has been provided and the impact of that on the front line in Ukraine. There are, of course, still a lot of issues in the pipeline and in terms of weapons procurement within Europe and in America. We haven't really seen a massive ramping up, as we were saying would probably be required for there to be game-changing shifts on the battlefield in Ukraine itself. I just wondered if you could give us a very brief update on whether there have been any developments that you've seen which would suggest a change of direction, or whether things are still rather slow.
There's actually really positive news on that front. We are seeing ramp-ups, and they're no longer just maximizing capacity. We actually are seeing ground broken on new production capabilities, particularly in Europe. So if that trend continues, and UK in particular, but also Poland, the Nordic countries, and the Baltics continue to up production, those contracts are getting in place. And if that pressure continues, it's going to be a situation where the West will be outproducing Russia. So from a more strategic perspective, because it's been shown Russia's not going to be able to do an offensive for a couple years, my recommendation overall would be, if you're a Western country, donating much deeper in your strategic reserves is perfectly acceptable as long as you're placing those 3 to 5 year contracts, because you'll be getting your new equipment before Russia is able to get their new equipment. So that's a part of the calculus too, is the quicker Russia is drawn down, the longer the West has for these contracts to take effect, which means you can really cut back on your strategic reserves. And that really hasn't set in with the West. But from a UK perspective, I'm sure Hamish is going to be, and Dom are going to be a little sad at this, but frankly, if you can give more Challenger 2s, more Leopards across the board and take higher risks simply because the likelihood of a further incursion by Russia is being pushed out months and years. That's the flip side, is now that we are seeing production capacity come online, that opens up a lot more freedom for Western governments to give more. It's not as much as it should be in terms of ramping up, but we are seeing the signs now.
Michael, thanks so much. Please do hang around if you are able to. I can see you're here. You're getting pinged in the background because work's just piling in. But please do hang around if you're able to. Hamish, I'd love to turn to you now. We've heard some really interesting stuff there about the nature of the fight in the Kursk Oblast. Can you zoom us down into the turret, please? We've seen images of what happened at the border crossing point last Tuesday. We've seen that Ukrainian tank just shooting the place up, working in concert with drones, not just coordinating, but integrating with drone forces. But for starters, please take us into the turret. What would we see, hear, feel when a tank goes into action?
Well, absolutely. Good afternoon, and really interesting stuff from Michael. And I absolutely agree with him. I mean, the fact there's been no counterattack after 11 days in what is great tank country. Kursk, we all know about the great tank battles in the Second World War. And we're seeing it now. First of all, before we get into the tank itself, I'm sure the tank crews are amazed that there are no mines and roadside bombs. They have hit the enemy quickly, really where it hurts, and when they're not looking, and so have made some progress into the actual sort of tactical minutiae of tank warfare. I mean, one of the things I find fascinating is how they've got to this stage of integration. That is not an inconsequential task to get all that coordination going. If you think you're sitting in a tank, and I spent many thousands of hours in the Challenger 2, and interestingly, the Challenger 2, the Russians seem to be fixated by Challenger 2. It has this psychological hold on them that they're focusing on that. And the videos that were posted yesterday, so-called Challenger 2 being taken out in Kursk, well, they're rubbish. It's a Challenger 2 in the first bit of the video, then it's then spliced with something else, and it's a Marder or something else that's taken out. So I think that is fascinating. But these are really small vehicles. It's very, very difficult unless you've actually been in a tank to appreciate it. And you'll know, Dom, you've got three of you squeezed into that turret with no room to swing anything. But they will now have a feed from the drones as well, which will sort of add to the complexity. Incredibly noisy as well. You can't really, you've got your headphones on, but you can't hear anything. I would say for those soldiers on the ground, those defenders, it's terrifying as well. You can imagine these tanks coming through the crossing at night. And if you're a young conscript who's got virtually no training, you're going to be going east at a huge rate. And that is obviously what has happened. But just in the preparation before we move on to the execution, when I was second in command of the 2nd Royal Tank Regiment preparing for the Second Gulf War, we did about 12 months of training in Germany and in Canada before being able to execute the sort of operations that we're seeing in Kursk at the moment. And when you think that Ukrainians have done this completely in secret, and where they've done it, we don't know. But, we're talking about thousands of troops and hundreds of vehicles. We don't know how many in total. But you would have thought, with this so-called open battlefield, a transparent battlefield, I think is the right term, that just couldn't happen. But it has. And, and the piece I wrote 2 days ago about the principles of war, still really standing good, surprise and concentration of force, reinforcing success, et cetera, that is all there. So when you go back to the actual activity itself, it would appear attacking on two lines. That means they need to coordinate between the two, potentially two battle groups or brigade minuses, as it were, being coordinated by our headquarters that's bringing air defence in, bringing the drones in, and bringing everything else. Really pretty complex stuff. We've seen a lot of Russian tanks taken out. We're yet to see many Ukrainians. And although we're focusing on the tanks, I'm sure a lot of the other activity is equally important. But I think, again, looking at the psychological element to this, the fact that the Russians are very much pointing at the challenge and the tanks, that is what is creating the psychological fear. And the fact that at the moment, the Russian forces that were there have pretty much done nothing except moved east at a great rate. And just a little bit on the logistics, Michael touched on it. And I think one of the interesting things of having Challenger on the front line is Challenger tank carries 52 rounds of main arm and ammunition. A Russian Soviet tank, T-72, T-64, generally carries about 32 rounds. So already you've got a tank that can sustain itself for much longer. Talk about fuel. Challenger will go, same with an Abrams, and I'm assuming the same for a T-72. You can go about 500 kilometres, or an Imperial, and Michael, we like Imperial. Some of us older folks, 300 miles, 250 miles. So the fact that they've gone in, 20 or 30 Ks at the moment, although sustaining a tank over a number of days, you're burning fuel up. I think the logistics thing is something that they seem to have covered, but you don't need to pull up a tank every 5 minutes, as perhaps, Dom, you do your Aston Martin when you're running that around. So I think really interesting elements here, and staggering that we have yet to see any discernitive counterattack. And I would agree, there's no indication, actually, that Russia can garner its forces. And I was speaking to some chums in the intelligence world who were perhaps suggesting, actually, the Russian army is absolutely on its hackers. Although they've got 600,000 people or so deployed in Ukraine and on the borders, they've got no reserve. There is no spare. They're absolutely scratching the bottom of the barrel. And they've got no mobile reserve. They can't magic these things up. So I think this incursion, the Ukrainians can probably hang on as long as they think it will achieve the aims that they do. And I don't see a massive Russian counterattack coming any day soon. Over.
Thanks, Hamish. Now, time's marching on. I know you've got got another very important media engagement very shortly, so we'll start to draw it to a close here. But Hamish, you wrote for us yesterday about you've just touched on nuclear escalation, where this might go. I want to stay sort of tactical if we can, but it would be remiss of us not to nod to the nuclear side. What were you saying yesterday, and how much do you think this ratchets up the risk when it comes to nuclear escalation?
Well, I absolutely don't. My thesis is that actually the nuclear threat and posturing by Russia is bluff and bluster. And I think there are too many leaders in the West and elsewhere, the nuclear piece is almost overriding in their decision-making process. Because, on the face of it, absolutely, you can see nobody wants Armageddon, nobody wants a nuclear conflict. But when you look, on the 23rd of February, 2022, Putin addressed the nation and said that any involvement by the West, ostensibly, would create mayhem, and indicated that would be nuclear mayhem. Now, absolutely, that hasn't happened. All the supposed red lines that the Russians have evaporated. It was tanks, it was air defense, it was long-range missiles. And ultimately, again, without going into the finite detail, Russian nuclear doctrine is pretty clear, and we know that the Russians are absolutely slaves to doctrine. But it does allow Putin to use these dreadful weapons in certain circumstances. And those circumstances of relevance to this are attack on Mother Russia. And when you think that this is the first time that Russian territory has been lost since the Second World War, it is almost the number one possibility or the number one rule that allows Putin to go nuclear if he wants to, this attack on Mother Russia. Now, it hasn't happened, I think, because it would be a tactical nuclear strike, and this is a battlefield nuclear strike. Most of the Iskander missiles that carry nuclear weapons have been repurposed for conventional. A lot of the airfields where the jets that would drop a tactical nuclear weapon have been taken out or are under such close surveillance that any movement towards that would be stopped. And since the countermover into Kursk, there has been no saber rattling. Usually we get Medvedev and Peskov and all the other Putin attack dogs screaming nuclear. Virtually every positive move that the Ukrainian forces made. We haven't heard this time. It strikes me, and other people who know about these things better than I tell me that they are rattled. They are really rattled. And the point of my piece yesterday was, come on, Western leaders, put your foot down and enable Ukraine to absolutely make the most out of this so that they can get the Russians to the negotiation table with conditions much more suited to Ukraine than before this incursion. Over.
We'll go to final thoughts now, please. And I can go to Francis first.
Well, thanks, Dom. Very brief one from me. Of course, as the impact and remarkable events taking place in Kursk, we've acquired many, many new listeners, for which, welcome. And I just thought I'd be generous to you, Dominic, extend my hand and recommend that those new listeners check out your episode of Defence in Depth, which you released yesterday. I know how excited people were when I last manned one on your behalf when you were away, saying, oh, isn't it nice to have a fresh face? But credit where credit's due. It's a brilliant video summarising the Kursk incursion. And if you're looking for maps and just a broad analysis of what has occurred in the last few days, you won't find a better one out there. So I recommend it to listeners. We'll have a link in the show notes.
Can we get a medic to Studio 2? I think Francis has collapsed. Sorry, Hamish, if you're still there, any final thoughts?
Just a quick one, really along Francis's piece. I mentioned the quote from Slim. Anybody who hasn't read Defeat into Victory of how Slim vanquished the Japanese out of Burma in the Second World War, read it, because actually it strikes me that the Ukrainian High Command have read it, and some of their actions over the last 10 days are straight out of Slim's book on how to vanquish an enemy out of your territory when it seems virtually impossible. So Defeat into Victory by Field Marshal Slim, in my opinion, our greatest general.
Thanks, Hamish. Michael, a pleasure, always a pleasure. We will have to do this again if you're able to. But please, any final thoughts for our listeners today?
I just want to say Ukraine kind of marched across Putin's biggest red line, grabbed the chalk and smashed it on his nose. And this is a point where the West should realize that his nuclear bluffing is bluffing. And Ukraine has a window of opportunity over the next 6 months where they really have a lot of freedom of maneuver and will have a lot of time to reconstitute and really make a difference. And if Western leaders actually start enforcing sanctions, start making sure they flow the equipment to Ukraine as promised, and start placing their own contracts to make sure coming down the pipeline there's new equipment, I think we are finally getting to a point where the balance and long-term trends will be against Russia enough that we could see the final end of the tunnel where negotiations might start to become viable. But it's going to take the West to ramp up all three of those categories that I mentioned.
Ukraine the Latest is an original podcast from the Telegraph. To support our work and to stay on top of all of our Ukraine news, analysis and dispatches from the ground, please subscribe to the Telegraph. You can get your first 3 months for just £1 at www.telegraph.co.uk/Ukraine the Latest. Or sign up to Dispatches, our foreign affairs newsletter, bringing stories from our award-winning foreign correspondents straight to your inbox. We also have a Ukraine Live blog on our website, where you can follow updates as they come in throughout the day, including insights from regular contributors to this podcast. We also do the same for other breaking international stories. You can listen to this conversation live at 1 p.m. London time each weekday on Twitter or X Spaces. Follow the Telegraph on X so that you don't miss it. To our listeners on YouTube, please note that due to issues beyond our control, there is sometimes a delay between broadcast and upload, so if you want to hear Ukraine the Latest as soon as it's released, do refer to podcast apps. If you appreciated this podcast, please consider following Ukraine the Latest on your preferred podcast app and leave us a review, as it helps others find the show. Please also share it with those who may not be aware we exist. As the disinformation war ramps up, we are relying on your support more than ever. You can also get in touch directly to ask questions or give comments by emailing ukrainepod@telegraph.co.uk. We do continue to read every message. You can also contact us directly on X. You can find our handles in the description for this episode. As ever, we are especially interested to hear where you are listening from around the world. Ukraine the Latest was today produced by Phil Atkins. Executive producers are David Knowles and Louisa Wells.